Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan Mader.
But what's more impressive to me about the
Chase Thornton.
Yeah, I mean, I got it.
Chris Dowhower.
Get him, Chase.
And Adam
No,
LaRue.
not necessarily, but it's again the same as
Don't hope to win. Be great and dominate.
All right. We're back here on a Wednesday night, a little earlier than we're used to, but that's all right. Hopefully catch us during your dinner hour on the East Coast, and maybe you're just getting out of work if you're sitting there on the West Coast. Operation Domination in the house. Thanks for tuning live on our YouTube channel. Be sure to catch us on your favorite podcast app so you can listen to us on the go. I'm your host, Dan Mader, joined here with Adam LaRue and Chris Dowhower, and a special guest we'll introduce in just a second. We are talking about the NFC West. Today is the last episode of our team profile series before we get into the nitty-gritty of full-fledged draft season. Training camp 1 week away. So we're wrapping up exactly at the right time. But with no further ado, let's get our guests introduced. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Sitting at the top right corner of your screen, the one, the only, the legendary, the host of Sirius XM and that Football Guys, FSWA Hall of Famer, Mr. Bob Harris.
I just recorded that so I can use it everywhere I go. Most notably the grocery store. And I appreciate you guys going early tonight. I'm quite old. Bedtime's very early. Everyone knows this. So appreciate that acknowledgement.
Hey, anytime that we can actually make our schedule accommodating to you, the guests, then that's exactly what we want to do. Oh, by the way, we have Chase in the building at just the nick of time as we jump into Kyler Murray, because we have no time to waste in this show. It is jam-packed because the NFC West covers like half your fantasy football landscape, and your draft's coming up this season right now. So we got Kyler Murray, like I said, in the building. All of us have him as a top 12 quarterback, bare minimum. Bob, you got him at 8, feeling pretty strong about him. What is it about Kyler Murray that you like heading into this season?
Feel like I might feel stronger about him as we get closer to the season. Look, I mean, he's obviously been very good at points in his career. We've seen him have a quarterback 2 or 3 finish there in year 2 under Cliff Kingsbury. I know this is a different offense. Drew Petzing, I was surprised last year he came in after an offseason spent rehabbing the torn ACL and ran an offense that he had never run before pretty confidently, right? I mean, he came in and just like went out. He started 8 games, threw for 1,799 yards, 13 total touchdowns, 10 passing, 3 rushing. But the final 4 games of the season were really impressive. Completed 70.3% of his passes, 935 yards, 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. The Cardinals led the league in total offense with 414 yards per game over that stretch. And Murray was quarterback 7. So, expecting him, and look, they have new weapons. They have one named Marvin Harrison Jr., maybe Trey Benson. I don't know if I expect much from him this year. I still think James Conner has a year left. We'll talk about that. But Trey McBride. So there are pieces there. I go back to something Ian Hartitz wrote a little while ago from Fantasy Life. And I think he finished quarterback 2. It was a 24.2 fantasy points per game average. He's one of just 7 quarterbacks who averaged more than 23.5 points per game in a single season in the last decade. So you're looking at a guy who could throw for 4,000 yards, rush for 500 plus yards. I think I might almost be low. I might be talking myself into a higher ranking even as we sit here.
Well, I got him the highest ranked at 6, but first I want to hear Chase's thoughts. You're a little bit lower, Chase. Is there some kind of caution there in the wins? Do you have him right sitting at 10?
Well, to kind of piggyback off what Bob said, yeah, I might actually feel better about him the closer we get to the season here. Yeah, he's got some new weapons, so we're not sure. We all think we know what we're getting with Marvin Harrison Jr., but we don't necessarily know yet. There's a lot of they vacated 2 of their top 3 receivers. There's 163 targets that are empty and waiting to go around. I expect most of those to go to Harrison. But the fact remains he hasn't played it down in the NFL yet. But Kyler Murray, like Bob said, he missed half the season, came in halfway through the year, basically cold, learning the offense on the fly. And we all know the jokes about Kyler Murray and watching film and how much he studies, but he looked like himself stat wise, at least from the very beginning. And then the last half of, last quarter actually of the year, but last half of his year, he really started to come on and looked just like the Kyler Murray we've seen before. His top target earner from last year, Trey McBride, will still be back. This is his second year now post ACL surgery. So that's usually the year we see guys who are runners, get comfortable making all of the cuts and making all of their plants and that. He's still a top 5 caliber running quarterback when he has the ball in his hands, I think. There's nothing but upside here, I think, with Kyler Murray. And, his ADP right now is quarterback 10, but he's got top 5 ceiling. So he's one of those guys you could wait on, and you could really find yourself happy with him come playoff time.
Yeah, I think what was most impressive to me was the fact that he comes off the ACL injury and it didn't hinder him as a rusher. 5.5 carries a game, 30.5 yards per game. Just to give you an idea what the 17-game pace on that would be is 94 carries, 518 yards, and 6 rushing touchdowns. And that's coming right off the ACL. JC touched on it. He's a year removed now. And he didn't look much different as a passer in the new offensive system halfway through the season. That's why, for me, I got him at 6. We've seen Kyler Murray finish in the top 5, two finishes in the top 5 over the last 5 years, in fact. And he was QB9 on a points per game basis from week 9 week 8 when he came back and started. So I don't know what the downside is for Kyler Murray other than you're worried about him getting injured again potentially, but I think that was really impressive. He came back and fired on all cylinders. Let's dive into our next quarterback. That's Brock Purdy. Now, with Purdy, we know he has all the weapons. We know he's in the offense. We know last year he finishes a QB8 on a points per game basis. Chris, you're the only one of the group that doesn't have him inside the top 12. What is it about Purdy you think might regress this season?
Well, as we've kind of alluded to, I think this might change as we get closer to the season. But for right now, what I'm looking at is the guys between 12 and 14 that I think are kind of sliding around for me, where I have a Trevor Lawrence in there, I have a Brock Purdy in there, and I have a Tua Tagovailoa in there. Guys who I think have upsides, all guys who I think I've seen produce. Now it's a matter of what do I think is going to project to next year. Purdy's that guy that I'm a bit worried that we might have seen the ceiling last year, Dan, in a lot of ways. We saw over 30 touchdown passes. We saw over the 4,000 yards. We saw the high production week in, week out. We saw a guy who, is pretty consistently getting you over 20 points a game. Didn't have a super high ceiling. Didn't get you over 30 points once, last year. Isn't a guy who's going to necessarily dominate a week for you, but is a guy that you like as your quarterback 1 option. So for me, I have him as right outside that, QB1, borderline option. So I think right there that last starter kind of in those 12-team leagues is kind of where I'm debating some guys, and I have him just a little bit lower where Trevor Lawrence's upside, especially rushing potential, but higher. But at Brock Purdy's a guy I can see easily sliding up there. I'm waiting, Dan, also to see what kind of happens with this Brandon Ayuk situation. I think if they lose Brandon Ayuk, that's going to be a huge loss for this passing attack. I think Brock Purdy has a chance to have more attempts this year, but like I said, the efficiency was incredible last year. So will the numbers really change that much?
The efficiency is incredible, and it's going to be that balance. So they get a little bit more volume. Bob, you have him at 12, so you do have him as that last starter in your 12-man league rankings. Talk about that a little bit.
I think Chris really nailed it. I mean, the big issue for him is you don't have that rushing equity that you're going to get with some of the other quarterbacks. I do feel like if he slid a little bit more, that would make me happy. And he may well. We're sitting here talking about our rankings July. Some of this is I think we'll all acknowledge is flag planting a little bit on some players that we like, but there are players I like I have Jaden Daniels ahead of him. If I was getting Jaden Daniels and I wanted to be super comfortable at the quarterback position, I might come around, double tap, and hit like a guy like Purdy. Or there are others. Trevor Lawrence is a guy that just mentioned that I think a year ago we were talking about him as an ascending talent in a great offense. And if were it not for some injuries and poor offensive line play, maybe he would have been that. So there's a whole wealth of quarterbacks available later. But give me the one in the Shanahan offense, playing with a great supporting cast, and we'll see. We'll talk about Ayuk, but I think we tend to get a little bit overheated about these things. The public portions of negotiations are always the most contentious portion of negotiations. And while the work and the concerning thing about that, there's no work apparently being done behind the scenes at the moment. There is no negotiations, but we'll see. The 49ers have a tendency to drag these things out and make everybody super nervous. That's last year's Nick Bosa, or a couple of years ago, Deebo Samuel, same situation. So we'll see how it goes. But I like, it's the Shanahan offense, and Shanahan has the perfect automaton. And I say this in the nicest way possible, the mini Shanahan running his offense. This is what Kyle Shanahan always wants. He wants himself or a factotum of himself on the field running his offense, and he's got that.
Yeah, he's always wanted that. He's always wanted that. It's funny that you mentioned Purdy and Jaden Daniels. That's actually like been my biggest best ball strategy throughout the entire summer, is double tapping Jaden Daniels and Brock Purdy and pairing those two up for the upside play and the floor play that you get at the quarterback position. I'm just going to point this out. With this supporting cast, and I'm kind of with Bob here, I don't see a scenario in which Brandon Ayuk's not on the San Francisco 49ers, at least for this season. And assuming that with the addition of Ricky Pearsall, I don't see him getting below 30 passing touchdowns. And I use that quite a bit as a barometer. And in the last 10 years, there's only been 2 quarterbacks that have thrown for 30 touchdowns that have not finished inside the top 12. It was Ben Roethlisberger. He went over 30 back in 2020. He finished as QB 14. Kirk Cousins went 30 exactly in 2018 and finished as QB 13. So kind of just mapping out the 2 guys who didn't finish inside the top 12 were still inside the top 14. So you're working with the safe floor there, and he's going to be hovering, I think, around that mark, safe to say. Matthew Stafford is somebody that we want to get into too. He's a great NFL quarterback, but somebody who maybe doesn't necessarily finish in that top range for you for fantasy purposes. And all of us pretty much have him in that QB2 range. Adam, you got him at 18. What are you looking at for Matthew Stafford in your preview this season?
Yeah, this is a weird offense in a lot of ways. Just, you have the 2 great receivers, you have the great running back, but there's some question marks on both of those ends. You've got a quarterback that, I mean, I'm a massive fan of Stafford, and I have been for a long time. But I mean, the reality of the situation is we haven't seen the rankings here over the last 2 seasons, really, since the first season in LA, and then it had been a couple years, and then we're going like almost 6-7 years back before we've seen it in Detroit. So we have 1 great year, his first year in LA, and then since then fantasy hasn't really been the strong suit for him. I actually think that there's a chance for a positive regression as far as touchdowns go, because he was a really efficient passer, especially at the beginning of last year, and just not seeing touchdowns. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if that ticked up. I just don't know that I like his upside as much as other guys in this range. He falls in a really competitive tier of quarterbacks for me. And then like it falls off a cliff pretty shortly afterwards. So I think he just falls at the back end of a tier where I think he is similar to guys around him. I just haven't seen it from him in longer, so he kind of falls to the back of the group.
I gotta say, I'm not here for this Demarcus Robinson slander I just heard, Adam. I'll accept your apology now. There are 3 good receivers now.
He has been one of those guys that you always find yourself talking about the waiver wire, right?
Oh yeah.
I was like, Jordan Rodriguez wrote about him the other day, saying he seems to be aging in reverse, and it is kind of true. But that late season run he had was super impressive, and I think it is worth noting. I mean, that might give them an additional weapon and something that gives you a little more. I mean, I think we're all comfortable with Stafford where he's going. Like if you end up landing him as your quarterback too, you're going all right, and probably deal with it. And there are going to be good weeks, but definitely that receiving core. We always say this every year going in, like, well, if this guy's going to be wide receiver 7 and this guy is going to be wide receiver 2, somebody's got to be throwing to them. It doesn't always end up like turning out that way, right? So I think we're not being over enthusiastic is correct, and I apologize for my Demarcus Robinson rant out of nowhere.
Dan, can I jump in real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
The one thing I just wanted to say is one thing I think the upside, that maybe Adam alluded to for Stafford is what Brock Purdy was able to do with that 49er offense. You see a lot of similarities. 2 receivers you can feature, running back that you're going to look to get the ball to. Is it going to be efficient? Is it going to be huge upside? No, you're not going to be 50-point games. But Stafford's one of those quarterbacks I feel like you can trust the floor where he's going to get close to 300 yards per game. He's going to get a couple touchdown passes most of the time. So it's not a guy who's going to have a super low floor and does have a pretty solid ceiling where you can get some similar. You talked about that 30 touchdown passes. Matthew Stafford getting 3 touchdown passes is definitely not out of the realm of possibility where he could be that top 12 guy.
It's not out of the realm of possibility, but even though he's had great weapons throughout his career, he's only done it 3 times in his 12-year career. That's been kind of the downfall of Matthew Stafford, is he hasn't really hit that mark very consistently. I think to your point of the floor, he's something we're always going to be talking about as a streaming option, right? You get stuck in a hard place, one of your quarterbacks goes down, he's somebody you could kind of pick up and stream off the waiver wire because he is going to have that offense. The best thing about Stafford, I think, is just because he's such a great NFL quarterback, he does great things for our fantasy assets that we really care about as we go into throughout this show. I guess quickly, we'll talk a little Geno Smith, even though it's not going to be too much of a factor. I think for fantasy drafts in particular, if he does make an impact, it would likely be off your waiver wire. But Bob, this was a guy who finished as a QB5 2 years ago, QB8 on a points per game basis. Then last year comes back, he's QB25. Do you see any room for going back to what he was a couple of years ago, or is Geno Smith kind of is what he is?
100% room for him to go back to where he was, because Ryan Grubb is why. We'll talk about this with his receiving assets as well. He's another guy he's got all this receiving talent. What are they going to do? We've seen a run-heavy Seattle offense in the past under Pete Carroll and the previous coordinators, whether it's Shane Waldron, who probably didn't want it to be, and Brian Schottenheimer, who probably didn't know how else to do it. It's going to be a different offense that we're going to see. That said, if they're going to throw the ball a ton, we'll see if he's up to it. This regime is not Mike Donald, the new head coach, and he's not have any allegiance to him. They brought in Sam Howell, who threw the ball a hell of a lot last year, and so they've got plenty of arms. And so I think that's the biggest concern right now. Are they 100% sold on him? If things get tough, will they be willing to move on? See what they have in Sam Howell seems likely.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility too. One of the things that stick out to me that I have concerns with Geno Smith being able to bounce back is that his play in general is not just a touchdown regression. His play in general really kind of suffered from year to year here. I mean, his red zone completion percentage, as we know, with the touchdowns went down. It went from 17th to 27th. The biggest concern I had was his clean pocket percentage went from 3rd to 22nd. That's really not a good mark. So those things have to really be able to bounce back, I think, for him to be able to bounce back.